Right, still on the issue of Census 2022 in South Africa, we're joined now by founder and executive director of Access Chapter 2, Steve Letsike. They join us now to speak about how the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning intersex and asexual community is affected by the census and if it assists in terms of policy interventions. A very good evening to you, Stephen. Thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, I think let's start with the numbers in South Africa. I read a study a while ago saying that South Africa is one of the most friendliest, particularly in terms of Africa, to the community. Is there a significant number in South Africa to date? Figures in 2019 put it at 630,000 of people who were willing to identify as part of the LGBTQI plus community. Is the stigma less now that people are willing to come out during the census and say, yes, I am proudly part of the community?
Look, attitude, first let me just greet you and the viewers of SABC and thank you for really bringing me onto the show. But I must say that attitude does change. There's quite a lot of movement because we have allies, we have stakeholders, communities opening up. When you look at what has been, 5 years, 10 years ago, it's not what we have now. Of course, we've seen many challenges of stigma, of discrimination, violence against LGBTI persons. Even in the last 18 months, we've seen actually skyrocketing, triggering brutal murders, brutal attacks against LGBTI community. It's a concern, but it doesn't take away that yes, there has been attitude change, there's been improvement, progresses in society. South Africa still is a home to many LGBTI persons, but it's also a desired home to LGBTI persons who are not coming from South Africa as well.
South Africa has that rare history of where the majority was itself segregated and, of course, oppressed to a point that it enjoyed very little of the mineral riches of the country. And from a policy standpoint, this was done, deliberately so. The community falls within the minority. Has there been any evidence that from a policy standpoint, when government embraced not only the existence thereof, but extended the rights to the community, that it has inculcated whatever information it received from the census to change policy, to change the structural imbalances that has to do with the community?
Look, you're spot on. Our history of oppression, our history and legacy of prejudice still exists. It manifests in various ways, and that's the biggest problem. We have a history of discrimination on the basis of color of our skin. We have a history of discrimination because of sex, and that's why we're still fighting for gender equality as a country. And we are still not at a level where we can say gender equality is seen. But we also have a history of prejudice on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the criminalization that even this country has experienced for people of same sex. That on its own did change legally. Our constitutional order, our democracy has actually guaranteed the importance of human rights for all. Section 9 of our constitution, that is quite clear that nobody should be discriminated on the basis of their sexual orientation, sex, gender identity, and many other grounds, taking into consideration the intersectional lens that we always have to reflect on. Now, what has now happened in terms of how we advance these rights, whether our policies have actually shifted this element? Yes, You look at some of the legislative framework that was brought in, Act 49 of 2003, change of sex description. People can change their gender marker. You know, some of the calls that have been made that intersex babies, when they are born, they must not be they must not experience unnecessary surgeries. You actually realize that there has been progress over time. Some is snail pace, some is moving fast. And we have seen beautiful legislations that must be put in action in every way. Now, here we are, we have the opportunity as a country, every 10 years we come and we count numbers of people who are here. Our understanding of the population and understanding the nature of population so that you prepare, our planning must understand even those who have been oppressed, even those who were left behind, even those who needed to be liberated for that matter, needs to be counted. How do we prepare economically, socially, and politically for that? What kind of programs do we need? And how do you actually ensure that you provide the much needed services? You ought to understand your population better if you ask and consult and get the right information correctly, not wait after 20 years to do the miscounting in this. And that's exactly the kind of mistake South Africa is doing now.
Particularly in which areas, and you talk about how it manifests, Steve. In 1998, the legal framework changed, but I understand that in terms of a normative, just values and principles, norms and values rather, the majority still unduly benefits. Unemployment, for instance, in the 2011 census put unemployment for same-sex families at 30.11%, as opposed to those who fall under this, the dominant groups, irrespective of race. We're talking about even people who are cisgender, gender conforming.
Look, unemployment affects everybody. Poverty, challenges all of us. But we must understand that the likelihood, and even particularly the livelihood of LGBTI person, will be experiencing multiple levels of discrimination. We cannot shy away how there has been societal denial and even justice denial, for equality for all. LGBTI people continue to be discriminated. The world of work has not necessarily been open and inclusive and even diverse for that matter. People have been rejected by their own families. Even in school, we've been dealing for a number of cases for that matter. The population, we have global estimations that between 10 to 20% of communities are LGBTI person, and you even gave the previous statistics for that matter. What we ought to understand, when we understand our population, we're more likely to know exactly what we're dealing with. So we cannot compare, the numbers of the majority versus the numbers of the minority for that matter. Now, let's reflect a little bit. Are we actually creating opportunities for all where there is no barriers of access to those opportunities? And yes, technically and according to our legislative frameworks, we are doing so. Our order of laws and legislations are quite clear. But in terms of practicalities that we see in realistic manner, there has been exclusion because of societal knowledge, societal expectation, and societal exclusion for that matter. The toxic communities we live in will continue to really exclude LGBTI people for that matter. So I think we are due to really look deeper to what are the systematic social and structural barriers that puts LGBTI people at the back end. It does not take away by the way, from the lack of opportunity that is open to the broader community. I'm not taking that away, but we are then looking at, does any kind of marginalization continue to perpetuate this exclusion of LGBTI people in this era? And that's exactly the reflection that we are ought to be talking on. And that's what we are picking up. And the previous census that then estimated a percentage of 13% and so forth, you would then have to estimate a ratio or calculate how many LGBTI people participated in that, and of which categories, whether in urban, rural areas, or where even in the categories or where they have access to that. We miss the population every now and then if we don't ask the right thing or reach out into a broader community for that matter.
So, Steve, as a final question, and those figures really were meant to highlight, and perhaps I should have provided the unemployment figures for the broader population, but there's just so much figures to deal with. The point was to look at what would you recommend the government do in terms of protective legislation, the monitoring, the implementation, particularly the design. The landscape has changed since 2011. And not just in freedom or lack thereof. As you say, while we've progressed, there's also been regressive behavior, the continued stigmatization, greater violence inflicted upon the community. How should government use this to help, alleviate the barriers faced by the community?
For us, it's quite key, including gender and sexual orientation, and the right sex definition does matter. And simply, and perhaps most importantly, to capture and recognize that LGBTI or even diverse population matter. So I think for us, we must never miss that opportunity. In fact, the size estimate even of the LGBTI population could easily be picked up here. We would understand this and it will help us to plan better. So I think for us, first, Department of Home Affairs need to ensure it fast-track its third legal gender recognition so that it also eliminates some of these discourses we find replicating in many other departments. Stats SA in the past has been consistent in ensuring that it documents and it captures the right questions that needs to be asked. The current census exclude intersex and transgender individual. And I think it is our call as LGBTI organizations that Stats SA, this new census, it's quite new and it can be resolved urgently if they address it. Ensure that the sex description is not only just the binary context of male and female, include intersex. Thirdly, ensure that you don't exclude transgender and look at the binary context of gender definition for that matter. But in addition to it, Stats SA, it's counting in the households, the makeup in families and so forth. You must understand, the kind of outside the box of nuclear context, heteronormativity context, that there are various diverse population for that matter, and you do not have to exclude the context of sexual orientation and gender identity. It must be captured accordingly. So for us, that is our immediate correction on the Stats SA questionnaire. And then our government still has the responsibility to ensure it fast-track the implementation of laws, but it also has to ensure the protection and fulfillment of these rights that are enshrined in the Constitution.
All right. Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, Steve. There are lots of questions I wanted to ask you, particularly if attitudes have changed. But thank you so much for your time, particularly your insights. Founder and Executive Director of Access Chapter 2, Steve Letsike, speaking to us about how the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning intersex and asexual community is affected by the census, and if it does assist at all in terms of policy directives. Well, That's what's happening on that front. Let's take a quick break.